We need to be having those conversations early, because if you're having this conversation at 39 or 40, it might be too late. We thought about, what's holding people back from testing. The biggest reason is they're afraid. They're afraid what it means for them in terms of the shidduch perspective. They're afraid about what it will mean for them having a family. And I see this all the time. Reproduction and fertility is so much of an unknown. People don't know a lot about it. And generally human nature is to be afraid of the things you don't know. And so there is so much fear and shame around fertility and infertility, and that holds people back.
Giving birth is one of the most significant events of your life. Sadly, the joy that you should feel can often be replaced with anxiety and helplessness instead. As a labor and delivery nurse, I'm revealing insider information to educate you, reassure you, and decrease your fear. In this podcast, you'll hear empowering birth stories and experts weigh in on a range of topics. Being Jewish also has me exploring Judaism's influence on the reproductive experience. However, I speak to anyone wishing to navigate their journey with more joy and confidence. I'm your host, Chani Fingerer, and you're listening to the Happy Birthway Podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Happy Birthway Podcast. If you are enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and following and subscribing on other podcast listening apps. This really helps us get the podcast out to more people. Usually in the first week of releasing an episode on this podcast, there are about 500 listeners. If each of you listeners can share this podcast with just one friend, then we can have another 500 people find out about this podcast and maybe learn something new that they didn't know before that can vastly improve their lives. I would so very much appreciate if each of you took the time to share this with just one friend. Before we start the interview, I wanted to let you know about a great new course for preteen girls called Girls Growing Up. Let's be real, many mothers have a hard time talking to their daughters about puberty. Well, Dr. Alyssa Hellman, who's a girl mom and an Orthodox gynecologist, has you covered. She designed this course, which is designed to be understood by preteen girls and watched with or without their mothers. It covers the Torah perspective, anatomy definitions and diagrams with helpful explanations to prepare young girls for the changes of puberty, all in an easy-to-understand, comfortable way. You can sign up at theconfidentkala.com or through Dr. Hellman's Instagram page at theconfidentkala. Today, I am so excited to be interviewing Dr. Batsheva Lerner Maslow. Dr. Maslow is double board certified in obstetrics and gynecology and reproductive endocrinology. She is a reproductive endocrinologist and the director of research at Extend Fertility, where she specializes in counseling women about their fertility and options for fertility preservation. In addition, Dr. Maslow provides the full spectrum of infertility care at Extend Fertility and Premium Health Center. Dr. Maslow lectures and writes on the intersection of halacha and reproduction, and is frequently called upon as an advisor for questions related to Hilchot Nida. She serves as the Director of Medical Education for the North American Yoatzot Halacha program and sits on the founding board of directors of the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association. Dr. Maslow graduated magna cum laude from Barnard College with a BA in history before attending the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, where she received an MD with distinction and was induced into the Alpha Omega Alpha Medical Honor Society. Dr. Maslow completed residency training in obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Pennsylvania and subspecialty training in reproductive endocrinology and infertility at the University of Connecticut, where she also completed a master's degree in clinical and translational research. Oh my gosh, do you have enough credentials?
I told you didn't have to read the whole thing.
No, I wanted to because I think it also gives a background as to the extent of your training. And I actually love that you trained in Connecticut for a little bit. I know UConn. It is such a great and amazing place, so it's pretty cool.
We actually really miss living in Connecticut.
Yeah, it's a good place for many reasons, and it's nice to travel into New York for a day or two,
Yeah.
And then I'm happy to come back. So please, Dr. Maslow, can you tell us exactly what it is that you do at Extend Fertility? It is a clinic, correct?
Yes. So at Extend, most of what I do is clinical, seeing patients from day to day. I would say a little more than half the patients I see, maybe 60% of the patients that I see are typically single women who are interested in fertility preservation or egg freezing. So I see a lot of women over the course of a year who are interested. We talk, we counsel, and many of them move forward with the process. And then about 40% of the patients that I see are kind of more traditional infertility, couples who are trying to conceive, or women who are coming back to use their frozen eggs. So now that I've been here for long enough, I've started to accumulate a really nice population of patients who are coming back to use their frozen eggs, which is really, really nice to see. But yeah, that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. I do infertility counseling and treatment, retrievals and transfers and ultrasounds and IUIs, and I love it.
That is just incredible. I love that you have patients coming back for their eggs to actually use them and have babies. That's incredible. Yeah. And it must be so gratifying.
It really truly is very gratifying. It's really interesting. A lot of, I would say, REIs, and for a long time the infertility community, it was found egg freezing to be very almost like emotionally challenging from the doctor standpoint, because the end game is, it's such a long delayed sort of satisfaction, right? I see patients, the typical woman who's freezing her eggs isn't intending on using them for, somewhere between 3 to 5 years. So you really kind of have to play the long game and say, okay, we'll focus on how many eggs we get, and that will sort of be our interim success. And then it's really nice to have been around long enough now that I'm starting to see women who are coming back. And that's really the best narrative that kind of needs to get shared. And it's, egg freezing is still relatively new. So this is really the cutting edge of what's happening. But the narrative of, I froze my eggs 4 or 5 years ago. I found my partner, we're having a family, we run into trouble, and now I get to use these frozen eggs instead of having to go down a much more challenging infertility route, is really just, it's like finally sort of the culmination of what I've been doing for the last few years. It's very exciting.
How long can eggs stay frozen for? Do they have a shelf life?
So technically they can stay frozen forever. They don't have a shelf life. They're actually, they are what we call vitrified. So first the eggs get dehydrated, and the egg is the largest, just to go into the science of it a little bit, the egg is the largest cell in the human body. And for those of you who maybe remember back in 9th grade biology about cell structure and surface to volume ratios and all of that, the eggs have a very low surface to volume ratio, which means they have a very high amount of cytoplasm, so a lot of water content, which is what made egg freezing so technically challenging for so long, because when you freeze water, it turns into ice, and ice expands, and then that ruptures the membrane. And so the newer technologies that developed in the last 15 years or so is that we vitrify the eggs. So they become dehydrated, and then we flash freeze them in liquid nitrogen at minus 196 degrees centigrade. And they become this sort of glass-like state. And that keeps them completely metabolically inactive. So they're literally frozen in time, and they remain that way until they're thawed. So yeah, there's technically no shelf life. There was this controversy in the UK. It's really interesting. Actually, right now it's in the news in the UK. So the UK had this rule about so they have National Healthcare Service. So there are some coverage for egg freezing. And they had this rule that the eggs had to be used within 10 years. And it was not related to the stability of the eggs, but rather a concern about women becoming mothers at too old an age, quote unquote. And this was really troubling to a lot of people, especially now that it's been around for a while. They made this rule like 8 or 9 years ago. So the women who froze their eggs 8 or 9 years ago were kind of coming up on their 10th anniversary. Some of them froze their eggs when they were 30, and now they're 38 or 39. That's hardly, quote unquote, too old. And they were running up against the possibility that they would throw away their eggs. So it was a whole to do. And right now they're extending it to 55 years, I think. So that's to combat the sense that they don't want to be storing eggs forever and ever, but at least it's giving people a lot more flexibility on how to use them. That was a long answer to your question that the eggs really can be stored for pretty much indefinitely.
Yeah, I think the oldest patient I had who actually, I don't know if it was her egg that she froze or if it was someone else's egg that was frozen, was 52 and did well. So yeah, it's really interesting. And ethically, oh my gosh, I'm sure there's like thousands of different ethical considerations in your field. Like this is life that we're dealing with. Like you are literally a facilitator of bringing life into this world.
Thank God.
That is, first of all, a huge privilege. And second of all, in terms of halachic considerations, Jewish law considerations, there are also so many factors that have to be accounted for. You serve on advisory boards for different halachic authorities, and I'm sure you get tons of rabbis, halachic authorities contacting you to just learn more about what's going on so that they can make their decision. Can you speak on that? Can you tell us like different scenarios, the most common questions that you get?
Yeah, sure. So you're right in that it can get a little bit complicated. Thank God I feel very, very privileged to be able to do what I'm doing and also have been, accepted and made really great relationships within the Jewish community. I mean, I speak to Rabbanim really like mitzad latzad from like the entire range of Judaism in all walks of life, from like super Hasidish to like, conservative reform, like everywhere in between on, asking me sort of my opinions or kind of clarification on what's happening in reality. And it's hard because it's not something that the patient gets to see necessarily in terms of what they're experiencing. They don't always know what's happening behind the scenes. And so it's really a good opportunity to engage with the community. And it's one of my favorite things to do. So to start with, halacha and Jewish law kind of comes at fertility from a very different place than some of the other religious ethical spheres that are debating some of these issues. I often, I guess pre-COVID, used to go around and give lectures and be scholar in residence in different shuls and things. And one of the lectures that I have is comparing different religions and how they approach fertility and reproductive technologies. Pre-COVID, when I used to travel places. But, from a Jewish perspective, we start with this tremendous value for Jewish families. The first mitzvah in the Torah is PUAH. There's this directive to create Jewish families. And that really opened the door for halachically to feel like we're going to try and make this new technology something that can work within the Jewish framework. Now, generally speaking, halacha is not usually, or Jewish law is not usually like an early adopter of new technologies and new things, particularly in medicine. But when IVF was first coming to be in the early 80s, there was a lot of curiosity and a lot of interest in looking at these reproductive technologies, specifically because it could help grow Jewish families. And there was a lot of discomfort with it, as you might imagine. Here you have, literally taking embryos, playing with life, quote unquote, playing God, quote unquote. There were a lot of concerns about the possibility of mixing up embryos or mixing up eggs or sperm. And so a lot of the kind of initial discussions and opinions about utilizing IVF and utilizing other reproductive technologies was around ensuring that the eggs or embryos would not, or sperm would not get mixed up. And so that bore organizations like PUAH, which is an organization that started in Israel, but is very readily available in the United States. There's another organization called ATime. Both of those offer all sorts of support and a lot of different resources. But one of the primary things that they do is provide an observer, like a hashgacha, for in the embryology lab so that they can certify that these eggs belong to this person and this embryo belongs to this person. And there may not, depending on who you ask, is a question of whether that's absolutely needed. But there certainly are people who, they only will feel comfortable moving forward with IVF or moving forward with one of these reproductive technologies, with that extra.
It sounds like a Chalav Yisrael, Chalav Stam situation.
It's very, very similar. Very, very similar. So, and it tends to fall along similar hashkafic lines. But it's a similar idea. How much can we feel comfortable relying upon the regulations that are in place? I will tell you, as a physician and somebody who spends time in the embryology lab, mix-ups in the embryology lab is our worst nightmare, right? It's not just whether it's a Jewish person or a not Jewish person. That's like the worst nightmare. And, yes, the few stories that have happened over the years make the news and it's devastating. But there are a lot of protocols that we have in place in our labs to make sure that those don't happen. And we follow them. We have every time anything is moved, there's signatures, there's barcodes, there's two people, there's witnesses. I mean, we have all these systems in place to make sure that that's not a concern. And when people come to me and ask me why did the Jewish people have extra certification? You know what it is? In my mind, it's less a kashrus, like a kosher hashgacha, observing to make sure there's no mistakes thought process, and more of a one day down the line, this embryo is going to be a person, hopefully, who's going to get married and hopefully have children of their own. And, in a world where a lot of Jewish law is based on testimony and somebody witnessing something, if this embryo is created in the lab, there's no one to witness to say, to stand up in a Jewish court of law and say, okay, I witnessed that this child belongs to this family. And so it's less so about a worry that there's really going to be a mistake and more so about being able to maintain some of that sort of halachic continuity. So I like to look at it that way.
Like an aid.
Yeah, exactly. Like an aid.
Like in the same way we have aidim for marriage, for gerus, for conversions.
Yeah, exactly.
This is kind of like an aid. That's so interesting. Technology creates so many different halachic considerations. Like when halacha was written in the Talmud and centuries ago, this was completely something that was unimagined. I think it creates so many challenges. Like, how do we apply all the things that we know? Yeah.
And that's why, it's just it's such an interesting from an academic, halachic perspective. It's a really unique case study, right? It's never been done like this. There's always been a hesitation to innovate in halacha, right? Halacha tends to say, let's see how things go. Let's see how this unfolds. Let's debate it. And we just watched the halachic process essentially unfold over the course of 30 or 40 years, where it normally takes hundreds of years, right? And that happened. Why did that happen? It happened because we have such a strong devotion and value to growing Jewish families. And we look at this technology and say, oh my gosh, this is a technology that is going to allow us to grow so many Jewish families. We have to figure out a way to do this where people feel comfortable. And so that's where the shift or the mindset has been over the last 20, 30 years. And now that, IVF really has come such a long way. Our success rates are, thank God, so high. We have all these other pieces to it that we're doing, right? So I see patients who unfortunately have a child with some kind of genetic disorder, who are now, they're not infertile. They're now coming to me to do IVF to prevent having another child with a genetic disorder, or they find out they're carriers for a genetic disorder, right? This is something that we never could have thought of as a possibility even 20 years ago, or if we tried, the chances of success were really so low. At this point, the chances of success are great. There's a lot that depends on the age, the quality of the eggs. There's a lot of variables here, but generally speaking, this is something that could be very successful and not something we would have thought of in the past. And I think people are taking advantage of that opportunity. I recently, just to kind of pull it all together, I recently just published this paper with some of my colleagues from JOMA that we were talking about fertility considerations in women who are BRCA positive. So BRCA is a genetic mutation that leads to a predisposition to breast and ovarian cancer. It's a genetic mutation that is what we call a founder mutation. So it's very common in Ashkenazi Jewish populations. It's found in other populations as well, but it's definitely something that we see more frequently in Ashkenazi Jewish populations. That's why we hear of a lot of Ashkenazi Jewish women, unfortunately, having breast cancer, sometimes at young ages, and they tend to run in families. But you don't necessarily have to have a family history of breast and ovarian cancer to have the mutation and to then be found that you yourself may be at risk for one of these cancers as you get older.
Yeah, I did an interview with someone who had the BRCA mutation, and she talks about all the prophylactic actions that she took because of that mutation. She was brave and she actually got tested. I'm going to let you expound on the article that you published that's amazing on that testing piece.
So recently, the U.S. Preventative Task Force opened up the genetic testing pretty much to almost anybody who would want it. It used to be that it was an expensive test. To get it covered by insurance, you had to prove you had a family history or some serious concern. And now it basically anybody, especially if you are Ashkenazi, can get this test and be tested for BRCA. Whole nother question about who should and when to do it that I'm not going to touch upon. But suffice it to say that over the last 1 to 2 years, and certainly in the coming few years, we're going to see a lot of young men and women who get this test done and find out that they're carriers. And there are all sorts of preventative actions that you can take in order to lower the risk of breast and ovarian cancer.
And men are carriers too.
So men can be carriers. Whether it the kind of health concerns that we see for male carriers are not quite as dramatic as they are for female carriers, but men can get breast cancer.
Can they transmit the BRCA mutation to their offspring? So if they have a daughter?
Exactly. So that's the most important piece, is that if you have a family that carries the BRCA gene, people tend to think that they're only going to test their daughters. But the truth is that if the son is a carrier, that son can then transmit it to his children. And this is where reproduction and fertility conversations are very important. So there's two things to think about. One is women who are BRCA carriers are often recommended to have a mastectomy, so remove the breast tissue before they could develop a breast cancer, and remove the ovaries, which will essentially put them into menopause. And the recommendation is, depending on a variety of different factors, somewhere between the ages of 35 and 40. And it was kind of traditionally thought that by the time women got to 35 or 40, they were done having children. And so you could remove their ovaries and it really wouldn't be a big deal. And the truth is that's like the farthest thing from the truth. So there are many women who are just starting families between 35 and 40, or who are trying to grow their families between 35 and 40. There are women who are still single at 35 and 40. There are also women who may not want to wait that long because they're worried about ovarian cancer. They have some other additional concern. And so what starts to happen is you have to play these mental mind games of, am I done having babies so that I can have my ovaries removed? Or do I push off having my ovaries removed and potentially risk getting ovarian cancer to see how long it takes to have a child or more children, right? It's this very kind of crazy game to play. And so one of the things we realized out of our conversations, we had this multi-specialty panel at our first JOMA conference that included me and some breast specialists. And when we had these conversations, what was clear was if we could offer these women fertility preservation, meaning you preserve either eggs or embryos early in life, let's say in their early 30s, then they can have a really good chance of using those eggs or embryos if they need to have a child or have more children later on in life. And they can have their ovaries removed when they want to or when they think it's appropriate. And they could still get pregnant safely without ovaries if you have frozen eggs or embryos.
That's mind-blowing.
It's like mind-blowing. And it's so interesting because that kind of conclusion happened because we got all these different specialists in the room. Like, I knew the reproductive piece, but I didn't know that much about the breast cancer piece. And like, we all got together in a room. We're all Jewish women physicians, and we're like, this is a community, this is going to affect our community. And we came up with this like discussion about how we can take our each unique expertise and kind of create a new recommendation that might benefit the community. It was really amazing. So that's number one. And the second piece is exactly what you said about transmitting to the next generation. And you can test embryos for the BRCA gene. The challenge is that BRCA is a gene that we call is a dominant mutation, meaning you only need one copy of the mutation in order to potentially be at risk for breast cancer or ovarian cancer or some of the other health concerns, which means that 50% of the offspring, whether it's the male or the female, so 50% of the eggs and 50% of the sperm are going to carry this mutation. And so 50% of the embryos will roughly carry the mutation as well. And what happens as women get older is that the quantity and the quality of their eggs decline. So the chances of having enough embryos to have both a healthy embryo and one that's not a carrier of BRCA goes down significantly as women get older. So this is a conversation that really needs to happen like in the late 20s or early 30s so that you can act upon it if somebody wants to do this process. And that's also like a corollary from the whole egg freezing conversation. Because I spend so much time talking to women about egg freezing, I really live in these conversations and have learned to say, like, wait a second, like this conversation also applies in these other circumstances.
It like serves double purpose, the egg retrieval and freezing in a situation where someone's got the BRCA mutation.
Yeah, no, it's incredible. The only perspective, they're afraid about what it will mean for them having a family. And I see this all the time that people are, reproduction and fertility is so much of an unknown. People don't know a lot about it. And generally human nature is to be afraid of the things you don't know. And so there is so much fear and shame around fertility and infertility, and that holds people back. So, when I see women who come to me for egg freezing, the earlier we have those conversations, the more options there are, the more opportunities there are, but people are afraid. I do see that with kind of the more classic egg freezing example of a young single woman, my patients are coming to me much earlier than they used to. I used to get, when I first started, I would have my average patient age, I think, was 36. And everyone would say, nobody knows I'm here. I haven't told a single person. I don't know anybody who's done this. Everyone's going to think I'm crazy. I'm just doing this because, XYZ reason I feel I need to do it, but it's not something I'm sharing with anybody. Now, my average age is more like 34. And it's always, I have a million friends who are doing this. I feel like I have to do this now because everybody's doing it. I'm doing it together with 3 or 4 of my friends.
It's awesome. Have an egg retrieval party.
Yeah.
Bring your friends over and just make a party out of it, like the Botox parties.
Yeah. I mean, I have patients who have Shabbos meals together and they all do their injections at the same time. It's much more, it's less taboo. People are collaborating around it. I think it's more, it always had a sense of empowerment, but this gives, it's more of a communal empowerment of, okay, we don't have to ostracize our young single women, and we can give them opportunities to feel empowered by the position that they're in. And it's really actually very gratifying. Most women who come into my office, the truth is, no matter what you're coming into my office for, nobody's happy to walk into a fertility specialist's office. This was not plan A on anybody's agenda. Particularly the single women who walk into my office are really very vulnerable because they really are facing this realization of, okay, this is not at all the way I expected my life to be. And what steps can I take? And, some feel, at least initially, feel empowered to be like, okay, I'm taking control of the situation. I'm going to freeze my egg so I can feel that I'm doing something to help preserve my chances of having the family that I'm hoping for. Others feel very forced. They're like, I feel like I have to do this because otherwise I may not have the chance to have a family. Like my circumstances are forcing me to do this. I thank God, I think almost always by the end of the result, people feel happy about what they've accomplished. And not always, look, everybody's different. But I do feel like one of the things that's special about how I relate to my patients is really recognizing that vulnerability, and particularly in the Jewish community. Women who are single in the Jewish community really get marginalized.
They're just not as included because Jewish society is constructed surrounding family events and family things.
Yeah, I do have it. It's not super common, but I have a handful of Orthodox patients who are considering or who have done, who are trying to get pregnant on their own, or who say not without being married.
Yeah, I recently heard of someone who did that. She was single. She was like 50 or close to 50. And she said, listen, I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but I want a child. And she was actually super to the right.
I would say, yeah, the handful of patients that I have they're kind of all across the board. I wouldn't say that they fall into one type of orthodoxy or not. I think they're all very similar in recognizing not only how much they want to have a family, but also how much you could become more involved in a community. And I really see it. Look, as communities, we are super welcoming generally of single moms, right? You have women who are unfortunately widowed or they are divorced and they're moving to a new community with small kids. I mean, everybody's welcoming this woman, right? Then there's a whole built-in network, right? You have friends who are moms of your child. You get to, there's shul, there's groups, there's PTA, there's school. There's a whole social construct that can exist around motherhood in our communities. And that's sort of a way in for women who are really on the outside of that. And the truth is the women or couples who are infertile in the Jewish community feel a very similar marginalization, right? They also are kind of out on the outside of some of these really deeply bred social constructs. I'm glad that I think the conversations around infertility are changing in the community. I think that social media and all of these organizations have really done a lot to open the eyes of the community, to say like infertility is common. There's lots of people struggling. We don't have to pretend it's not happening, and we don't have to make those people feel ashamed for what's happening.
Yeah, it's amazing how we've increased people's access to information like this and to support like this. I learned so much from you, and I think by extension, I found Amy Barron from I Was Supposed to Have a Baby, who I also interviewed.
Good friend of mine. In real life, not only we've been friends in real life for a long time, not only on social media.
You guys should do like a reel together,
She's much better at reels than I am. I haven't
Have you done any
reel? No, I can't. I don't know how to do that kind of stuff.
They're so complicated and annoying. I do them anyway.
I barely have time to do the ones like just regular posts. I do them as much as I can. It's really, I'd have to. The truth is, I really enjoy social media. I think that it has opened up the opportunity to give information, not only to the people who need it, right? Not only to the woman who's single or to the couple who's struggling with infertility, but to the community around those people, right? That now there's so much about fertility treatment that just the common person doesn't even know. I had no idea that this is what my friends who have infertility are going through, or I had no idea that I could, how I could help support my single friend who's doing egg freezing, right? And so it's so fun and so rewarding to be able to get that information out there. And to, I have like this motto on my social media is like educate, engage, and empower. Right? To give over information, engage communities, right? Let's talk about some of these difficult, challenging things. We didn't even talk about third party reproduction, right? Egg donation, surrogacy. This is stuff that's happening in the Jewish community. Let's engage and talk about it. And the more we talk about it, the more we normalize it and destigmatize it. And the more we open it up as an opportunity for people who might need that. And then empowering people with knowledge, not only the actual knowledge that might help them, but also I think, when I was growing up, there weren't a lot, there were some, but there weren't a lot of like from female physicians that I could look up to. There were no, when I was in medical training, there were no from female fertility physicians. That's a lot of F's or F sounds. So there were no other Orthodox female fertility physicians before me to look to. And, I went to a pretty yeshivish high school where it was, I already knew I wanted to go into medicine from the time, I was like in 6th or 7th grade when I knew I wanted to go into medicine for sure. And I can't even count the number of times that I've had, teachers in high school who tried to convince me not to, or who were like, you can't be a from mom and do this. Like, this is never going to work for you. This is never, whatever. I think the one of the major powers of JOMA is to be able to have all of these Orthodox women who managed to get through medical training, managed to get through medical school. Thank God many of us are married with children, to be role models.
And to lend each other support, because it can be super isolating when people don't know the reality of the training and of the work it requires. And like you said, there's a lot of discouragement and people like maybe even condescension. So you don't feel alone like that. You feel like when you have that passion, there's no holding you back. Yeah. So I feel like it's amazing that you're providing that support to each other. It's incredible.
And then I think social media allows us to kind of expose ourselves to other people and say, look, this is what real life is like. It's not easy, right? Like, here's my crazy day trying to run around, and, here are my failures, and here's where it gets really hard, but here's where it's really rewarding. And so it's not sugarcoating it, but it allows young women who might be thinking about this to be able to say, like, oh, look, like, this is what it's like. It's doable, but it's hard.
I would love for your teachers who discouraged you to see that now. Not only were you able to and in the process of raising a beautiful family, which you talk about a lot on your Instagram account, which I want to also give our listeners the address to in a second, but you are actually helping create so many families, so many Jewish families. Wouldn't that be cool? Like, hey guys, I know you discouraged me. I went for what my passion and what I think I was born for. And not only that, but I'm not just raising my family, I'm helping people create their own families.
Yeah. I had this crazy moment on Erev Rosh Hashanah where all of a sudden I was getting like, and I guess I'm just hit this point in my career where I have enough patients sort of in the world, and I'm on social media, and I was getting all these messages either via text message or WhatsApp or on direct message on Instagram of like people sending me pictures of their babies, thanking them for this like beautiful gift that they had this year. And it was so, I'm like tearing up just thinking about it.
It's like your grandbabies.
It was it was this crazy moment of like going into going into the Yom Noraim and saying like, holy cow, like there are all these families that are out there. It was really like very, very, very special and very meaningful and kind of mind blowing.
You're truly a messenger of God. It's amazing. Yeah. It's just incredible. So we can talk about this forever. I want to ask you this important question. I think a lot of our listeners are probably wondering, at what age do you recommend starting this process of preserving your fertility, of harvesting eggs?
So the best outcomes are going to happen when fertility preservation or egg freezing happens between, let's say, 30 and 34, right? That's kind of the golden age for egg freezing, is between 30 and 34. And I say, like, I have patients who come to me who are as young as like 27, 28. And every once in a while, I'll pick up something where somebody's ovarian reserve is really low. And I actually say like, oh gosh, we got to do this right now. But most of the time, it's a little bit of reassurance of, okay, things look good. And, you could do this now and it'll be great. Or we can come back in 6 to 12 months and revisit it, and it'll probably be similar. So yes, like it can go a little bit on the younger end, and it can go a little bit on the older end. Certainly there are people who are 35, 36, 37 who maybe didn't have the opportunity or didn't know about it, or they really just couldn't. It's, like I said, a very emotionally difficult kind of situation to be in. You could still very much have a successful egg freezing cycle or cycles process, even in your late 30s. We technically will see patients up until 45, but generally I would say 42 is sort of my, I don't make hard and fast rules, but usually after 42, unless there are some really extenuating circumstances, I generally discourage people from freezing their eggs, because you're ultimately spending a lot of money on something that's probably less likely to work. So it involves a very serious conversation of, okay, does this really make sense for you? And sometimes it does. I'm a big fan of, like I said, empowering my patients and giving them all the options and recognizing all the limitations, including emotional limitations, physical limitations, time limitations, financial limitations, and then letting them sort of figure out what makes the most sense for them.
I think the people who are having their kids when they're younger, they don't think about fertility testing or anything like that. They try to have kids, and then if it doesn't work, they look for their next step, their next options. But I think it's so good that people who are single or who are not having kids and don't plan on having kids until a little bit later, I think it's so important for them to get that fertility testing earlier on, because the older you get, the more complicated it gets, and we don't want to extend extra time. So that's kind of like what they're doing when they come to you also. They're basically getting a full panel of making sure that their fertility is intact. So not only freezing eggs, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. I mean, part of the whole process is a consultation where, it's a lot of education. It's just basic fertility biology of like, this is what happens to women as we get older. What's the difference between egg quantity and egg quality, and why is it important to freeze good quality eggs? The goal really of egg freezing is to be able to preserve a group of eggs that has a higher percentage of good quality eggs, so that if you experience infertility in the future, which you may not, or it may not be with a first child, it might be with a second or a third, your chances of success are going to be dependent on the age of the eggs that are being used. So if you have younger eggs frozen, you'll have higher chances of success. And in the Jewish communities where we want to have large families, if you don't start early, or you don't get the opportunity to start early, if you want to have 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever it may be, children, you're automatically talking about trying to conceive in your late 30s and early 40s, where we know there are challenges. Now, it may not be, not every late 30s, early 40s person experiences infertility, but many can. And certainly there are other things that, miscarriage rates go up, it takes longer, all of those things can come into play. And so sometimes I tell people, like, you're freezing your eggs not necessarily for your first baby, maybe it's for your fourth baby.
It makes a lot of sense. How many eggs do you freeze when you do this?
So I mean, generally what we try to do is we'll freeze as many as we can get from each person. It's just so variable from person to person. So part of the assessment is trying to give everyone kind of a realistic expectation for what they might be able to get. And it's going to be based on age and kind of our assessments of egg supply. So just to kind of get into the nitty-gritty a little bit, there's we could do a blood test called AMH, or anti-mullerian hormone, which, just to briefly sort of describe it, is we use it as a marker of egg supply. So the higher that hormone is, the more eggs there could be. And it's not perfect. It has a lot of flaws, but it's really our best tool to help give somebody an idea of, okay, are we expecting a lot of eggs? Are we expecting not a lot of eggs? Or kind of everywhere in between? And then based on their age, we can give them a sense of, well, okay, I think you're going to freeze, 10 to 12 eggs, and this is what your chances of success will be with 10 to 12 eggs. And 10 to 12 eggs is going to be more likely to be successful in a 31-year-old than it is going to be in a 39-year-old.
I imagine that your patients have first a full genetic panel, right, to see if there are any problems, and I guess then you isolate genes, which I think is like insane.
So it's a little hard. So the truth is that the egg, because it's just a single cell, we can't actually test the egg at the egg stage because there's not enough DNA, or you destroy the cell in the process, which is why we end up having to freeze so many eggs, right? We're trying to freeze enough so you could feel reasonably comfortable that there might be healthy or more than one healthy egg in there. It's kind of like a raffle ticket, right? The more raffle tickets you have, the better the chances that you're going to have a winner. But once the eggs are made to embryos, similar to what we were talking about before, then those embryos can be tested to make sure that there aren't, generally speaking, we look at large chromosomal abnormalities. So chromosomes, either excess chromosomes, things like Down syndrome, or missing chromosomes like Turner syndrome, or all these other things that don't have syndromes because they typically just don't work. But really, we're looking for large, either duplicated or deleted chromosomal errors. But then if there are particular mutations, like we talked about, then at that point, you can also test for these teeny tiny mutations. You just have to know to look for them.
This whole technology is just, it's mind-boggling. It's astonishing. One last question I have for you, going back to the ethical considerations, because this is something I always wondered. What are the halachic opinions on egg donors?
You mean receiving egg donation or donating it?
Both, I would say.
It, as you might imagine, it's complicated. But like with a lot of things related to fertility, there isn't like a blanket, no, that's not allowed, right? You would think taking, essentially, an egg donor cycle is, here I have a couple. She has no eggs, let's say, for whatever reason. She went into, let's be the most extreme, she went into early menopause, right? So she's 32 and she went into early menopause. She has no eggs. There's no chance, or very little chance, that she's going to be able to conceive with her own eggs. She could take eggs from somebody else. They could be fertilized with her husband's sperm. The embryo can be put into her uterus, and she can carry the pregnancy like any other pregnancy, birth that baby like any other baby, but the baby is not going to carry her genetic material. So that's an egg donor. And you would think that that would be something that would be like completely halachically not allowed. But it is there. Certainly it's being done in depending on circumstances. And, there are a lot of different questions of whether it's preferable to have, a known donor, an anonymous donor, a Jewish donor, a not Jewish donor. Is the kid considered Jewish? Is the kid considered not Jewish? Does the kid need to be converted? What if it's a Kohen? There's all these questions that are being discussed. And I think being discussed in a way that's like, how can we find a path to be comfortable with this? Rather than, I'm not going near that at all. And the flip side is true too. So let's say, again, to take the most extreme example, couple is married, she's born without a uterus. So she has perfectly healthy ovaries and eggs, but she has no uterus. You can take eggs from her and her husband, so the two of them make embryos just like you would in a normal pregnancy, except you put it in somebody else's uterus to carry the pregnancy, and that person births the baby, right? So that it's the technical term for that is a gestational carrier. How does halacha view that? This is the same thing. Should the carrier be Jewish? Should the carrier not be Jewish? Whose baby is that halachically?
Single, married.
Yeah. Is it, again, Kohen, all these things like come into play. Do you need to convert the baby? Do you not need to convert the baby? And there are all different opinions that I'm not going to get into. But those two are opposing, meaning if you hold that the woman who births the baby is the mother, then you can't also hold that the egg is the mother, right? They're kind of opposing. There are definitely poskim who are more familiar, who are grappling with these issues. We had in my community, we had a kind of like a forum with the local POSAC, and there happened to be several families in our community that utilized surrogacy or gestational carrier. And we have, a pretty well-known POSAC who lives in our community, and he led the panel discussion, and we had some discussion about the technology and kind of how it's being used to grow families. And he made this statement of that he once oversaw on the same day in our local mikvah, his psak is to do kind of a semi conversion for any of these babies, basically just to be on the safe side. They do like a semi conversion for any of these babies. So he said they were doing one for a baby that was born with an egg donor and a baby that was born with a surrogate on the same day. And he's like, one of these babies, you can't say that both of them need to be converted, really, but we're doing it because we don't know which is
cover your bases.
Right. So, there's a lot of interesting halachic and ethical things that are happening around that. I don't pretend to know all the answers other than to say that it's, if this is something that's applicable to you or could be, that it really should not be, oh, like clearly that's usher. Clearly that's not allowed. That's the most important lesson here.
Basically, the answer is not no. Consult a very experienced posek in this area, and also Dr. Maslow. because this is the intersection between halacha and medicine. They both need to come into play. Dr. Maslow, I'm completely blown away by the work you do. Hashem should give you strength and health to be able to do this for many more decades, because you're strong. And if you got through all this med school and training that you got through, then you're strong enough to get through doing all this until you're 90. Abiyas HaMashiach.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking out the time out of your crazy busy schedule to come here and educate us and speak to us. This is just another platform where we can get the information out. And I just have to say, I love the aspect of empowering single women. Like you said, they're so marginalized to begin with, and they are in such a vulnerable place. And they're so lucky to have someone like you who gets that, who understands, who lives in that same society and understands what they're going through, and at the same time can empower them so that when they are 35 years old, they're not going to be rejected by a 55-year-old for a shidduch because their clock is ticking. More level the playing field more. Let's put it that way a little bit between men and women. Where can people reach you on social media? I know that you have an Instagram account. Can you give us the Instagram handle?
Sure. It's at BL Maslow MD on Instagram and Twitter, although I don't tweet that much, but mostly Instagram.
Maslow spelled Maslow. I'm going to put this in the show notes as well. So you're not thinking about starting a TikTok account, are you?
No, I can't.
Come on, wouldn't that be fun? Like juggling eggs,
I can't. I can't.
I know. It's not the age demographic yet, but in a decade or so.
Maybe that's where I'm going to have to go. But I'll have to learn how to dance better.
Yeah.
Or point at things. There's a lot of pointing at things, I think.
Oh my gosh, yes, totally. Just go like this, point, and then upload it. I still don't get it. I don't get why people like it so much, but I don't get why people like when I lip sync over something and then write a message about it, but it works. So I do it.
Yeah. For now, no. And for now, I don't let my kids on TikTok, but maybe one day they'll be old. I'll let them on TikTok and they can teach me how to do it. Thank you so much for having me. I love your podcast. I love your platform. I'm really excited.
Thank you. We have to have another episode with you and a breast specialist to have the conversation more in depth about the BRCA mutation, the BRCA mutation, because
that'd be great.
We really need to expound on that.
Thanks for tuning into the Happy Birthway podcast. Head over to Yoledet Academy on Instagram to continue the conversation. You'll find the link in the episode show notes, as well as links to any additional resources, products, and services mentioned here. If you love listening to the show, you can help it grow by sharing it with your friends and rating and reviewing it. To stay in the loop when new episodes are released, make sure to subscribe. Remember that your health needs are unique and require individualized medical advice. The podcast is not a replacement, and some of the information may not be appropriate for your specific circumstances. My mission is to educate you so that you can confidently collaborate with your healthcare team. I believe that a healthy mom and healthy baby are simply not enough. We also need a happy mom with an empowering birth experience.